PCS guides and things like that. And I've looked at a couple, and there is some really amazing content out there. But when looking at some of them, I realize that when it comes to the portion about the VA home loan and how that can be leveraged by an active duty service member, it doesn't always give the money breakdown of where are the specific nooks and crannies for how you can structure this as a really winning opportunity, leveraging some of the unique features of the VA home loan that don't exist within other types of financing, but both for your military sellers and buyers. Because I think a lot of times when we think about the VA home loan, we think about, okay, how can we best leverage this amazing financing option for buyers? But we forget that that's actually a win-win proposition for sellers as well. So today, I want to focus on PCS season, and I want to focus on the money breakdown of how, when you're meeting with, folks who are going to be PCSing, so maybe you're doing a listing presentation, they have a home they need to sell, or you're meeting with a buyer who's going to be relocating to your area, and you're speaking with them about the opportunity to buy and where to buy in your local community and how to get them the best winning option. So we're going to
Before
dive
you,
into this.
before you change the picture, go back one just real quick. Can we all take note of how much that little boy does not want that bear to go in that box? He's like, I know what happens to boxes when they go on that truck, and I am not losing this bear.
Yeah, I mean
That's
he's watched Toy Story a few too many times, right? To be like stressed out about that.
Yeah,
I
he's
have
like,
a
the
couple
government is not moving my bear. Continue, Chelsea, but I was just like,
100%.
a little
Yes.
kid.
And that's actually my best friend firsthand, when she PCSed one time, a box they thought was lost. They were coming from Hawaii, and then it was getting shipped in through like Port of New Orleans and then going to Florida. And there was a box with specific, very well loved toys in it that they thought was missing for about 3 weeks. And it was recovered. But I tell you, there was a 3-year-old little girl who was so unhappy about this situation. And I think she's had trust issues with moves ever since then. So I completely register with that little boy in that picture. Now, going into, so again, when we talk about PCS season, especially if you have somebody who is selling and buying or just selling, either of those scenarios, this oftentimes is a very fixed timeline and it's a fine dance, right? Like when we're talking about putting together a strategy, it is exactly that. Like you have certain checkpoints and you have certain, dates that you need to make sure happen, and that you don't want to have overlapping housing payments, especially if they're owning one home to going to purchasing another home. Sometimes they don't have the ability to hold both homes with purchasing the new one, and being able to put together a successful timeline for that person. And a lot that plays into that is their financing. And so with setting proper expectations, one of the jobs is to make sure, yes, things close on time, both from a buying and selling standpoint. But it's also, are we solving all of the issues with each closing that this person has presented as a potential concern? Are they concerned with their cash flow and what money they have to bring to their purchase closing? Likewise, are they concerned with their cash flow at the time of selling? Do they need to make a certain dollar amount back if they've only owned that home short term, that they don't have a lot of equity built up in that home to be able to play around with at the closing table? So identifying these unique needs, and a lot of times with these are short term, the goal is, yes, we would like for everybody to maintain homeownership and build generational wealth through subsequent purchases, but not always is that going to be the case or make sense for that individual. So we need to be cognizant of, if this is only going to be a short-term home ownership opportunity, what are we doing to help set them up for success with their purchase, with making sure that if they are going to end up selling 2 or 3 years from now, that they're going to be able to walk away from that home without owing money at the closing table, and vice versa for those sellers that we're getting ready to help them list and sell that home. How are we going to preserve those proceeds, knowing they may be critical for that upcoming purchase or that upcoming move, whatever the circumstances? This is where negotiating structure versus price. A lot of times we have a general knowledge about, okay, should we, negotiate a purchase price reduction, or should we negotiate repairs that need to be done, whether they're required or not required? Should we ask for closing cost assistance? Should we ask for closing concessions? Or should we maybe negotiate an interest rate buy down? I want to walk you guys through each scenario so you can really thoroughly explain this in a listing presentation to a seller about how you're going to properly structure what they're offering to buyers coming to their property to preserve their proceeds, but also the conversations where you're going to educate your military home buyers about how can we get you the best savings possible, whether the goal is one-time savings at closing or just long-term savings, which long-term could just mean 24 to 36 months, right? That's long-term to some folks. For some, it's 30 years. But looking at their individual situations to discover how should I properly structure this deal? What makes most sense? And the first thing that I really want to talk about with you guys is the difference between seller paid closing cost and seller paid concessions, because this is so commonly confused when it comes to the VA home loan. And not just real estate agents, lenders too. I can't tell you, I could probably go out and interview 10 different lenders right now, and maybe half of them would tell me that, oh, the VA allows 4% seller paid closing cost. And that is not true. I get where they're getting those numbers, but that's not exactly what the numbers math out to be.
Can I
When
ask
it comes to,
quick
yeah,
question? Is everybody okay? Like, do you give everybody permission to screenshot this if they want
oh,
to?
gosh, absolutely. And if you guys want my PowerPoint all day long, like anybody that's on here, you guys can reach out. And like, if you want to use some of the content and stuff, I'm completely fine with people ripping off and duplicating my stuff. Just because this is here to benefit your military sellers and your military home buyers, that anything that I use, if you want to use this content to help out active duty service members and veterans in your local community, you absolutely can, because we want the education out there. And especially like with PCS guides, beef it up, give all the VA loan information. So that way, not only are you attacking it from a real estate perspective, but you're also educating from the financing side of things as well. And you don't need to be the expert, right? That's why you partner with a, loan officer that is very knowledgeable about the VA home loan. But to be able to provide that upfront as a one-stop resource, so that PCS guide is everything they need and it's all encompassing. Absolutely, guys. Screenshot, ask me for a copy of the PowerPoint, any of that stuff. Now going back to the difference between seller paid closing cost and seller paid concessions. As I mentioned, a lot of lenders or real estate agents will say, oh, seller can contribute 4% to the buyer at closing. That is a valid number, but that's not valid communication. Seller paid closing cost, which are those traditional transactional costs, the lender fees, the appraisal fees, the credit report fees, the flood certificate, the title insurance costs, the courthouse recording fees. These are the things that can be contributed to in unlimited dollar amount by the seller. So whether these add up to $3,000 or $30,000, they can be contributed to whatever the total dollar amount is. There's no cap on this.
Okay, let's recap that again, because this is probably, as someone who trains agents around the country and has for some years, this is probably the number one thing that people confuse. So seller paid closing costs do not have the traditional percentage cap that we see running around the internet.
Unlimited.
Yes,
All right.
unlimited. Which
recap again for us. What are considered by the VA as seller paid closing costs?
So let's look at a loan estimate. I wish I had a sample of it, but I can send you guys a sample if you need it. When you're looking at a loan estimate or a closing disclosure, anybody who has financing gets one of these. Sections A, B, C, and E. Section D is just a recap of the cost from A, B, and C. But when you're looking at those are the standard costs that are being charged on the transaction: the lender fees, the appraisal fees, the title fees, the courthouse recording fees, the courier fees from the closing title or law office. These are the costs that are going to be standard on any transaction. So whether they're doing conventional financing, FHA, USDA, VA, jumbo, these are the costs that are going to be charged to that individual at the time of the closing of their financing. So what these costs add up to whether it's $3,000, $13,000, $30,000, the seller can contribute to these with no percentage cap. Now, with certain parts of these fees, like lender fees, we are capped based on guidelines of like how much somebody can charge as a lender to that home buyer or that homeowner if they're refinancing. But for the cost as a whole, when you add up all of those standard transactional costs, the seller can contribute with no cap to these, whatever the total amount is. So it's not a 4% limit. That is applicable, but it's applicable for another part of the VA home loan. When it comes to just seller paid closing costs that you're looking at, standardized on that loan estimate or that closing disclosure, there is no percentage cap. There is no dollar amount cap.
Right. That's an up to amount. I know in Texas and a lot of states, the seller contribution is an up to. So say, for example, you're like, oh, let's see, let's get the seller to contribute $12,000. Well, if the fees and prepaids that they are allowed to cover goes to $8,000, the buyer doesn't get that $4,000 back. So you have to be careful and typically ask the lender what the total closing costs are to make sure you don't exceed it, because they're negotiating based off sales price, closing costs, and if you overshoot closing costs, you don't get that money back.
Correct. Yeah, no cash back ever at closing. The buyer can be refunded their earnest money if there is the ability to do so based on what the seller is covering for their costs, but no cold hard cash can ever be given from seller to buyer at closing. Now let's switch gears. Let's talk about where that 4% number comes from that so many people get stuck in their head. It comes with seller paid concessions. A concession is different than a seller paid closing cost. These are for more than non-traditional items. The VA funding fee. So guys, remember, if it is somebody's first time use of their benefits and they're doing 100% financing, their funding fee is 2.15% of their loan amount at closing. And then if it's reuse or subsequent use of their benefit and they're doing no down payment, that would be 3.3%. Now, with the VA funding fee, yes, there are certain breakpoints where if the person decides to put a down payment and will reduce that funding fee, but just for today's example, it's about 2% to 3.3%, depending on the circumstances, if that is first time or reuse of that person's benefits. So that would easily fall underneath that 4% contribution amount. This can also be used for excess prepaid items, paying off buyer debts. And this is for whether somebody qualifies or doesn't qualify. When we have seller concessions that are available to use for a buyer, maybe it is a situation where without those concessions, our buyer can't close because these are debts that have to be paid off or reduced in order to help that person qualify. But it doesn't have to be that. It could just be peace of mind for that person knowing I'm reducing my debts or paying off some of my shorter term debts. I'm feeling better about my monthly household budget at the time of closing. In addition to those, we can use this for early lease buyouts. So maybe it's not that this person just PCS'd to your local community. Maybe they've been here for a year and they're renting and they've just renewed their lease, or maybe they've got 6 months left and they love what you're talking about as far as the opportunity to become a homeowner, to use their VA home loan benefits. But they don't want to have double housing payments. They don't want to pay their rent payment at the same time as they're having to pay a mortgage payment. And maybe they don't have the money to do the break early clause in their lease. A seller concession can be used for an early lease buyout, whether it's just paying off the remaining amount of months in that lease, or if there's like a break early clause where like they forfeit their security deposit and then pay 2 months in advance or whatever it is, that can be used towards that as well. Again, it's within the 4% limit, 4% of the purchase price at closing, but that is something that can be negotiated.
Question
Yes.
real quick. Okay. So what would you suggest that if an agent is working with a client and because they've been here with you, they fully understand all these things and they're like fighting for their buyer client and the buyer's lender doesn't know any of this and says that it's all the same and it's a total of 4% for everything, how would you suggest that the agent have that conversation with the lender in order to help the lender understand?
So I actually have, Dina, it's funny you brought that up because I have actually had 13 agents just in the month of January that I've had these conversations with where their buyer is working with a lender who is not familiar with all of the unique features of the VA home loan, and they are contesting or trying to argue against whether this is or is not available. Now, one thing I will say, sometimes it's a lender overlay where, yes, that part of the VA home loan exists, but the lender won't honor it. That's one you won't be able to work around. But if it is truly an educational deficit, you always can reach out to me and I can help provide you the education. Like, I'm not going to brand it my name. Like, you don't have to worry about that. But like, that is one of the things that we pride ourselves on, as a company, is we contribute to military communities as a whole. And so if it is something where you're like, this person is adamant they want to work with this lender, but this lender is doing them a disservice because they don't know the key features of this person's benefits, and they're telling us we can't do this, or this isn't an option, always know that my door is open, that you can come to me and I will help you with the scripting that you need to prepare in an email or a phone call conversation or getting the guideline information. We are all here to collectively work together, right? Like, that is the whole reason why the Moving the Military Network exists, is we're working together to help folks. So always reach out and leverage your peers too. I mean, there's so many agents within this network that maybe have already had that exact same thing happen, that there are people who would absolutely be willing to give you their time to help you understand how they overcame that objection or that issue with a lender that they worked with on the same exact issue.
And I love the way, and I was gonna say, I love the way that Chelsea went professional and said education deficit and not ignorance. I'm just saying.
Well, and I want to make sure I'm recapping this for everyone. You kind of said it, but you said it as it was a little bit of a brush over. So what you're also saying is there are lending institutions that, although this is available, they will not honor it. What do you mean by that, so that the agents on this call can get that understanding?
So how everything starts is when we look at the VA handbook. That is the core foundational set of guidelines that exist for VA home loans. Some lenders will underwrite just to those guidelines. So whatever that core foundation is, and when I say core foundation, this is like a 6,500 page handbook, so don't ever try to print it. But that is where all the guidelines are. Now, some lenders, from a risk perspective, may think that certain features or certain nuances of the VA home loan are too high risk for them to lend on. So for instance, the gift clause. This is one that always, like, people look at me like I'm bonkers, but gifts are actually allowed as part of the concession limit. So you could gift a hot tub to somebody. You could gift a lawnmower. You could gift a 2-day cruise. Like, these are 100% allowed that a seller could contribute to a buyer at closing from that 4% concessions. Not often does it happen, but it is something that is available, or the early rent buyout or the debt buy down. Some lenders may have an overlay that sits on top of those core guidelines that says, based on our risk tolerances, based on what we're comfortable with, we won't allow certain provisions of the VA guideline. We will override these. So, because
I
we
was
see
gonna say, Dina, and everybody on this call, no matter where you're at, service or what you've done, we have the VA handbook guideline, we have the standards, but this is where the lending organization has that add to, but not take away from, when they add the layers to it. What were you going to say, Dina?
Well, what I was going to say was what I want, and then you can keep rolling because we only got 30 minutes left. But what I want everybody to hear is, when someone tells you we can't do it, it doesn't mean it can't be done. Right. It just means that, like, we, meaning the institution that person works for, cannot do it. Because I've seen that a lot. I've used some of these. I've used the debt. I mean, I had a builder, when we used our VA home loan for the first time, pay off $5,000 of credit card debt for me. And people were like, you can't do that. And I'm like, well, you might not be able to, but this lender that I used was able to do that. And so, I just want to overlay this whole thing, and then Chelsea, you keep moving. Because a lender tells you they can't do it doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means that they and that institution can't do it. Nick, were you going
to? So prior to coming to Mutual, I was a managing broker to 800 agents in Dallas for 7 years. And I can't tell you how many times we had a VA loan bailed out. And at the time, my office mortgage partner was Brenda Morgrew, the Mutual of Omaha. She bailed out every single one of them and fixed it. So you're exactly right. Just because the lender says they can't do it doesn't mean it can't be done. Either they don't have the program, or they're not familiar, or they don't want to deal with it, whatever it's going to be. So you're exactly right, Dean. There's typically always a way to do it.
Thank you, Nick. I love that. All right, Chelsea, keep going.
Yeah, and one more thing just to conclude that, and unfortunately, where a lot of the most common myths and misconceptions come about with the VA home loan are because of lender overlays. Like you can't have a non-spouse, non-veteran co-borrower, often a lender overlay, because you can do that, that some of the myths that you have to buy before you sell, like another thing. And there's a class just on that where it's like lender created myths within the VA home loan, but that's a subject for another day. Now I actually want to go into, so let's talk about, again, that side-by-side comparison. So seller paid closing costs. Those are those standard transactional costs that no matter what type of financing, you're going to see those as a charge owed at closing. Concessions are different. Concessions are those extra items, the VA funding fee, early lease buyout, debt payoffs, whether they're required or not required. Certain gifts are allowed, temporary interest rate buy downs. This is where the strategic use of the VA home loan is needed, because with seller paid concessions, you can get very creative in the offering that you're delivering to the buyer, but also to the seller. Because with seller paid concessions, even if we're not talking about closing costs, we're just talking about how to leverage those concessions, there's actually a lot of financial benefit to both the seller and the buyer, which we don't usually think about that, right? Like if we're asking for seller paid concessions, that's money we're asking the seller to give up at closing. But I'm going to show you some comparisons here in a minute about why this is actually a winning strategy versus asking the seller to give money in other areas, such as a purchase price reduction. So let's give an example. So $400,000 purchase amount, VA loan, so 0% down. We're just going to say the base interest rate is 5.875%, and this is on a 30-year fixed mortgage. So this is the scenario we're working off of, okay? It's just one house. Option one would be asking the seller to reduce the purchase price by $20,000. So that immediately is a $20,000 hit. So we'll say this is a military seller getting ready to PCS. That is immediately a $20,000 hit to that person's bottom line. Now, what this looks like to the buyer, so over the lifetime of the loan, they will save, based on that one-time $20,000 purchase price reduction, $22,590 in interest based on that reduction at closing. And then, like I said, that's that one-time $20,000 reduction to the seller's bottom line. But now let's get more creative. So let's talk about when the seller concession can be leveraged for a temporary interest rate buy down. This is really key if when you're talking to the buyer that you're working with and you find out that at this point in their life, long-term home ownership in your community does not make sense because they know they're only going to be there for a couple of years and they know they probably never want to venture back to that area, or at least at this point, they just want to manage the day-to-day. They don't want to be an out-of-state homeowner. This is where identifying their short-term needs is such a key component, because when we look at how long someone is stationed in a particular area, a 2-1 interest rate buy down is a really key component to leverage with that person because the savings are huge. So for those of you who don't know what a 2-1 interest rate buy down is, at the time of closing, you take that base interest rate. So again, in this example, it was 5.875%. Then in the first year of the mortgage, so the first 12 months, it's 2% less. So it's 3.875. And then in the second year, it's 1% less. So it's 4.875. And then starting in the third year, it levels back out to that original interest rate. But just in the first year, on a $400,000 purchase, that's $485 a month in savings. Just in the first year. And then over the total time that they're in that home, so if we're just going to talk about 3-year period, that's $8,800 in savings to that person's monthly cost over the time that they're stationed there and they own that home. That is huge. That is way better placed money than, just asking for, a price reduction. That if they don't plan to own that home long term, they're not going to be in the home long enough for that price reduction to benefit them. And then this is also a great thing when you're working with sellers, offer this. Like if your strategy is that for every military homeowner that you work with that has a home to sell, that you want to attract military home buyers using their VA home loan benefit, this is a winning strategy to both the seller and the buyer. because the seller is going to have to contribute less than doing a price reduction. And then the buyer is going to have way more short-term savings if they know that their goal is only to be the homeowner of that home for a very short period of time.
Well, I want to make sure, and I put this in the chat, but I want to remind all of you as we go through these things, she's giving you options and empowerment, but you have to do an amazing buyer strategy session to know which of these options is smart. Because
Yes.
she has said this more than once, but short term, because can you just be explicit on what does 2-1 buy down actually mean? And at what point does the rate potentially change? Because I think that some people may not even know what 2-1 buy down means and why you keep saying temporary.
Yeah. So with this, so there are, and I'll show you the next slide talks about long-term buy down. So a permanent interest rate buy down is where seller gives money at closing to buyer, or seller gives money to buyer at closing that permanently reduces their interest rate. So it goes from 5.875 to whatever that permanent buy down rate is. Temporary buy downs are different. So the 2-1 interest rate buy down is where at closing, the original starting interest rate is 5.875. Then in the first year of the loan, it's 2% less. That's where the 2 comes from in the 2-1. Then in the second year, it's 1% less. And then starting in the third year of their mortgage, it goes back to that original interest rate of closing at 5.875%. But this is a much larger amount of savings. And once we get through each option, I'll show you a side by side for each so you can see exactly the dollar amount. But this is a huge amount of savings for somebody who plans to only own that home for a short period of time, maybe only during the time that they are stationed there, and they plan to, sell it before they PCS or ETS or whatever their circumstance is going to be. That is where having the conversations with that person. Do you have goals for long-term ownership? If you do, here's what you can do with that. And talking about building generational wealth, talking about the opportunity to turn a primary owned residence into an investment property when they move out of it and what the requirements of that are. Maybe if that doesn't sound appealing to them, because it doesn't to everybody, and not everybody's in that spot in their life where building wealth through real estate really hits home or resonates. So if their goal is to only just own this home for a temporary period of time, I'm making Dina, oh, I thought she was yawning. I'm like, I'm putting her to sleep. Nope, I'm making her sick. This is where asking those questions and really diving into that person's individual goals and circumstance. And again, just providing the education. I want to educate you on these different options so that way when you are deciding what makes most sense, I have all the cards on the table to know how to make that best decision. And then this is the example again for the permanent interest rate buy down. So this is where if our starting rate is 5.875, and that person, say the seller is giving 2% in discount cost at closing, which add up to $8,000. That then is going to reduce our interest rate to approximately 4.875%. So that is permanently reducing the monthly payment. And then over the lifetime of that loan, when I say lifetime, I mean all 30 years, that is an $89,754 savings. So if somebody has the goal of owning this home long term, that no matter where their travels take them, no matter where their military career takes them, no matter where they need to be for family, they plan to retain ownership over this home. That is where a permanent buy down will probably make more sense because the long-term savings are going to exceed the temporary savings in the other option. But this comes back to you have to ask the right questions. You have to level with them. And some folks may not even think about that. They might just be in the moment of buying a house and not thinking about when they're going to sell it or how long they plan to own it or if they're always going to occupy it as their primary residence. You have to be the educator in that. And that's why like beefing up your PCS guide is a really key component because then it's just a part of your process. When you're having that seller consultation, you're having that buyer consultation, you can naturally gravitate into these options and not even necessarily being the one that comes up with the solution, but just educates them on how they can decide the solution for themselves.
Well, and I love that you're saying that because here's the thing, a lot of people can say different things, but the VA loan, let's just, it's different, and yet different only works when you absolutely understand the structure and the components on it, and you start that. at your listing game plan or your buyer strategy session when you're actually talking about the use.
Yep. Now so I wanted to show the actual comparison so it makes sense. Like, again, I'm a visual learner more so than I am just somebody explaining it to me. So this is where, when you're looking at the best short-term option for those folks who don't plan to own their home more than a couple of years, a temporary interest rate buy down makes the most sense because it is the best short-term relief of savings and cost. But the best long-term value is a permanent interest rate buy down. So that's that person that maybe they already own other homes, other places that they've been stationed. They're already on their path in their journey to building generational wealth through reuse of their VA home loan benefits. So they're just thinking long-term gain. That is where the best value is, a permanent interest rate buy down. But in all of these scenarios, the biggest point I want to drive home, the least efficient option is a price reduction. And honestly, that's usually the most expensive option to the seller, because to really move that monthly payment where you're actually seeing a considerable reduction in principal and interest, like, that's a huge chunk of money that's going to be coming from the seller in comparison to other ways that we can reduce that person's mortgage payment that are going to preserve that seller's proceeds. Because here's the thing, a lot of people say, like, it's so hard to get a VA loan, purchase offer accepted. Well, make it a winning strategy for the seller and the buyer. Take the VA financing. Oh, go ahead.
I was actually going to ask that, Chelsea. Like, if you're on the sales side of this, like you're the listing agent, and you see an offer come through, it's a VA offer, and they've got $30,000 off the price or whatever, right? Any amount off the price. And I know that you're not a broker, and all of you are watching this are going to have to go ask your broker how they would handle this. But in this hypothetical la la land conversation, as the listing agent, would you approach the buyer's agent and say, "Hey, I'm just curious. Would your buyer prefer the price reduction or a lesser amount out of my seller's pocket with a bigger deficit to the payment?" Would you like reverse offer that scenario because then it's less to your seller, but the buyer has a better benefit, or no?
I've actually had agents that have done just that. And I don't know who all is on this call, but this was a conversation that twice we had in January. I had one agent, they were in an area of the Northeast that it is insanely difficult to get a VA loan purchase offer accepted. Like, it is an uphill battle. And it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is in that particular community. And that's where I'm like, well, let's take the VA loan out of it. Like, let's just talk about making this a winning opportunity for both the buyer and the seller and communicating that. And that was more on the buy side going to the listing side. But then the other one was a listing agent that came and was like, hey, they're asking, and it was literally the scenario, $20,000 purchase price reduction. My sellers don't have that. And it was an active duty seller that they just bought their home a couple years ago with 100% financing. The market's moved a little bit. Their equities moved a little bit from principal payments, but we're very realistically going to have to be bringing money to closing with now, real estate commissions and closing costs, and now this $20,000 purchase price reduction. So it became the conversation of, they came to me from the listing side, how can we make this where it's still a winning deal to the buyer, because we need to get their house sold because they are moving literally in less than 60 days and need to close on their new home purchase. How can we make this work? Like, they would have to ask family members for money. Like, it was just not a good situation. And this is literally where we broke it down. And we decided, like, hey, counter offer this offer. And instead of a $20,000 price reduction, offer them this. Here's either option A, the temporary buy down, or option B, the permanent buy down. And then present them the numbers. And sure enough, the buyer ended up doing that because the buyer's lender and the buyer's agent never educated them that there was other alternative options that would be a better bang for their buck.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. And I did share in the chat, you guys, one of the reasons that she's talking to both sides of this is she used to be a real estate agent and understands, like, how do I talk to clients, but how do I talk to agents at the same time? Because some people in the chat are like, "Oh my gosh, this is the greatest thing."
Oh, and
ever.
that's where we have right now. That's what makes this great. Is like, because there's both sides to it. You also have the competitive advantage, like you talked about. Well, how do we? Yeah, absolutely. You can talk to either side agent and come up with the best case scenario, like Chelsea said at the beginning, for both parties.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think on the real estate agent side, your job as a being a listing agent for a veteran, a VA loaned home is easy. The buyer side is more about having to educate listing agents. A lot of them are under the belief that the seller has to pay the VA funding fee, which is not true, and it's mind bending how many times I'd hear that in my office. I'm like, no, the seller doesn't pay it. So it's about, as a buyer's agent, if you're going to work with veterans, educate yourself and make sure you educate the listing agent when you present the offer, so they don't tell the seller, hey, just don't do this one because it's going to have a funding fee attached. And just real quick, speaking of funding fees, if you have a veteran buyer, be sure if they're 10% or more disabled with a VA, they don't pay the VA funding fee. If you are working with an active duty service member that has a Purple Heart, they don't pay a VA funding fee either. The reason is, when they become a veteran, they are going to go on they'll have a disability rating because they got a Purple Heart for something. So active duty Purple Heart doesn't pay it, and 10% or more disabled veteran, they don't pay a VA funding fee.
Love that. Thank you for the little sprinkles on top.
And then, with what Matt and Dina said, so I was, yes, an agent for many number of years before going to the dark side, aka the mortgage industry. But with the unique time that I went into real estate, it was January of 2011. And so I was 20 years old at the time. And in 2011, down in Tampa Bay, I thought it was a great time to get in real estate because I saw the opportunity, except I was oblivious to the rest of the world, knowing that the real estate market was awful at that time. But here's the thing that I learned about that is I really had to sharpen my skill sets in a very rapid pace because I knew I wanted to focus on working with military buyers and sellers that were coming in and out of MacDill Air Force Base. And I knew, okay, I have to be able to create winning situations when so many of these folks are in a circumstance where they're going to have to short sell or they're going to have to bring money to closing. These folks bought with 100% financing and now market values are plummeting. And like, how do I keep these people from having this permanent blemish on their credit report on the selling side, but also create a winning opportunity for a buyer who, would be just as comfortable with renting? And so that's where, like, right now, and we're not in that market in 2026, right? Like, nowhere near what it was then. But if you can find these nooks and crannies in these conversations and you can provide the education, this will really give you a winning advantage that will launch your career 10 times farther in the next 10 months than it would over the next 5-year period of just getting familiar with how do I create winning strategies for both sides of the transaction. You don't need to be the dual agent on both sides, but just getting comfortable with that. How do I present as a listing agent this option to the buyer's agent that gives an a la carte of, based on their goals, here's what my seller's going to offer. I'm giving different options. And same thing on the buyer side, knowing how to present to the listing side, hey, based on what your seller's goals may be, which usually is to preserve net proceeds, that's a pretty easy one. Here's the options that my buyer has proposed that would make sense for them as well. And again, it's just getting comfortable understanding. That's why working with a good lender helps, because they're going to help you on the number side of things, but then getting that talk track down and making sure that, again, it's a winning situation on both sides of the deal, because that is what helps get VA offers won as well. I hear all the time from agents, listing agents in my area, they hate VA financing for this, that, and the other reason. Well, let's take that out of it. Let's just create a winning contract. Let's not focus on the type of financing. Let's talk about creating a winning contract. And that in itself will help with overcoming a lot of those objections. And again, this is where everybody is going to have different goals. No two same people that are going to come in and out of your area. And I know I keep saying, like, I'm talking about PCS season. This doesn't have to be PCS season. Again, this can be somebody who is already in your community that is renting, but is not going to be long-term in your community. Maybe this is somebody who just ETS and now they're coming home and this was their original stomping ground and they want to plant permanent roots. And so they're looking at maybe making that first home purchase, or at least that first purchase that's going to lead to long-term home ownership. You have to meet people with where they're at, but you can't just assume where they're at, right? I think that is something that's troublesome with helping active duty service members, is a lot of us fall under the assumption that, well, this is what we would do. Just like with building generational wealth. Well, this is what we would do. We would buy a home every single place that we're stationed over, our 20 or however long year career. And then we would have all of this additional income opportunity, so on and so forth. Consumers don't always think like that. And even if they see the light bulb moment, like they completely understand what you're telling them, that still might not be right for them in the moment because everybody is different. And that's why you have to talk about, okay, how are we going to negotiate and structure your offer that meets you with where you're at, where your short-term goals are at, where your long-term goals are at? Because, a permanent interest rate buy down, yeah, that is the highest savings in the long term, but that doesn't mean that makes most sense for that person's situation. So sometimes the best solution overall isn't the best solution for that individual person. So getting really nitty gritty in your buyer consultations and asking those questions, same with your listing consultations, that's where you will really set yourself apart as an agent that really dives deep as a partner in that person's home purchase or a partner in that person's home sale versus just representing them as their real estate agent.
And I love on the bottom, go back one
Yep.
for me just a second. So under the least efficient option, I love that you just wrote this flat out. It's price reduction costs sellers 2.5 times more money while delivering the smallest benefit to buyers. But I feel like with most real estate transactions, that's really the only lever that gets pushed. And so I'm glad that
it becomes the easy button.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here talking about it.
And then two, this is one thing that you'll hear me talk a lot. I love when folks can come together to create a winning marketing strategy where it is military seller selling to military buyer. And especially too, when we talk about this opportunity, normally this gets brought up on like VA loan assumption classes, because that's the easiest way that we think it's going from, service member to service member. But it can be in other ways as well. And I'm not saying you have to exclusively market your listings to, military home buyers if it's a military seller. That's absolutely not the case. But when you can align those interests and they have mutual appreciation and respect of each other, this is where we really can come up with these incredible solutions where we are empowering that seller and that buyer to come to the closing table with the best end result. Whether that is, a temporary buy down and then that seller just preserved $10,000 in their proceeds that now they feel a little bit less weighted going into their next move wherever they end up being. But this is something when we talk about networking and you're really active in your local communities, you can create a community of awareness where, hey, I have these folks who are getting ready to PCS, or I have these folks, who have been in their home and they're getting ready to sell. What veterans, what active duty service members do I have out there? Because the seller is understanding of those intimate options or those unique features that can really benefit you in your purchase. And sometimes too, that is a motivating factor for a service member who has never bought a home to find out that there are military sellers out there that want to encourage homeownership from other service members. Like that has literally been a conversation where I have seen some people that have been on the fence, that they've been active for 10, 12, 15 years. My best friend being one of them, that she's been in service now for 13, 14 years. And she just only recently bought a house for the first time. And she bought it from somebody who was active duty, who was stationed alongside her, that the conversation just came up that she needed that encouragement and that empowerment from that other person that was mentoring her that said, hey, like it's crazy that you've been in this long and you've not yet used your VA home loan benefits, that you've not purchased a home. Why don't you come and purchase my home? And those are the types of relationships that we want to work to build because it's a greater service to the overall military community that you're in.
Well, and we'll have you sometime in the next month or two, we'll have her come back and do an assumptions class so that everyone understands how that works. But I know that you're just scratching the surface today, but we'll do an assumptions class for moving the military sometime soon.
Yep. And then again, with this one, when you can negotiate a really strong deal and you can do it from the get-go and all the pieces are in place from the beginning, this is where things will really move with the least amount of headaches, the least amount of hiccups. Everything is going to be more seamless and streamlined for both the buying and the selling side. And that is the goal. Because remember, especially when it comes to PCS season, This is like a fine lineup of dominoes that any one thing can make the whole line go down. So we want to be really smart about how we are putting together these timelines. How are we setting expectations? How are we partnering with the lender? How are we partnering with the listing agent and or the buyer's agent, depending on what side you're on? And we can do this, but again, all the homework, all the communication, all the education needs to be done up front. And then that way, everybody's on the same page. Everybody knows what the winning strategy is. And then we can move through the transaction in a seamless capacity. And that leads me to just kind of the last thing. I do have some scripts and stuff that I can send over to you guys. We won't go through these individually because I know we're almost at top of the hour. But a lot of times when you're looking at your relationship that you have with a lender, scripting for talking to a listing agent when it comes to overcoming objections to the VA home loan offer, like that might be something that you tap them into. I've even had some agents where they're like, I need you to call the listing agent to please help, get them to understand why this is a credible offer and it's not diminished because it's a VA home loan finance, contingency. But we don't think about coming to the lender for scripting with sellers, whether you're trying to win the listing or you're trying to help them understand the offer that's being presented to them. And it doesn't have to be just a military seller either. It could just be a seller in general that you are representing that maybe they are obstinate to what's being presented or they don't understand the benefit in it to them. They're only seeing the benefit to the buyer. This is where you can come to your lender partners and my door's open to you guys at any time. You guys can come and we can go back and forth and we can run, scripting and things like that to be able to help you guys in what those conversations look like and how you can clearly and concisely communicate this. So then that way, all cards are on the table. The seller knows exactly what they're getting. The buyer knows exactly what they're getting. And you feel really confident that I just made this happen. I made this happen because I knew the players that were on my team, that were in my corner, that were here to support me. And so that to me, in addition to hopefully knowing the different strategies now that you can use, is just know too, you have such an amazing network of both agents inside moving the military network that have probably experienced this to some extent that would be happy to hop on the phone with you or Zoom. But you also have like lenders like myself, and other team members at Mutual of Omaha Mortgage that would be happy to support you guys as well.
Chelsea, we are so excited that you're kind of pouring back into our people, and you are one of our people as well. And Nick, thanks for coming into the call as well. So I'm going to remove the spotlight. Anyone, we always reserve the last couple of minutes. And I want to say this before we open it up. If you have a particular question about a particular deal you're currently working, please just reach out to her like personally. We don't want to air clients' information here on
Yes, please don't.
so
Yeah.
please don't do that. But if you have a general tactics question or something like that that you want to know how should I do something, and it's a generalist question, go ahead and feel free. We're going to stop the recording so you guys can ask whatever.